I made a version of this video originally on my old channel, but I'm here to give an updated opinion on how I'd rank every Berserk arc, this time for patrons exclusively. The list has changed since my original video, but let's not waste any more time and get into it. Number 6, the Fantasia arc. There was great conflict internally with me in determining where to put the Fantasia arc. I reduced it down to two options: either I show some massive balls and put Fantasia at number 1 for having the greatest moment in Berserk history, or I pussy out and put it in the 6th position because it's only just started relative to everything else. And as you can see, I took the pussy way out. I think I'm comfortable putting Fantasia in 6th place with an asterisk that says "we will see." So far the Fantasia arc has been great, just not a whole lot has happened. The Sea God stuff with Guts was boring. I hate all the fights in Berserk. They all feel like wastes of time, so watching Guts kill hundreds of weird sea monsters inside the god wasn't exactly the most exciting thing for me. But the kids really did shine in this arc. Isma is a great character and she only exists in this arc, so all the admiration I have for her as a character is directly attributed to this arc. I love the dynamic she plays into with the budding, obvious romance between Isidro and Shirake. It's especially interesting when Isma and Isidro are more fun to watch together, even though the audience probably likes Shirake better. They maybe are rooting for Isma to be the winner in this love triangle thing that we have going on here. Let's hope this ends a lot differently from the last one though. The art is at its best in Fantasia. The first chapter of this arc, while not being the Hill of Swords like the previous arc, is an artistic masterpiece as Miura flexes his superiority onto all of us with double-page spread after double-page spread of environments and fantastical creatures. But the imagery with the sea god is also sublime, and I think video essays have been written on certain pages when the crew arrives at Elfhelm. Not to mention how elegant Falconia looks in just about every panel it appears in. Falconia is exclusive to the Fantasia arc. Not to mention the slap page, which is a lot of people's personal favourite. The crew is also a highlight of this arc, as the character interactions are probably the best they have ever been in this arc, which is only bolstered by the fact that we have the most characters together that we care about in one place ever. Isidro, Shirake, Isma, Roderick, Puck, Farnese, Guts, Magnifico, Casca, Serpico, and Azan are all in one place, and they basically all have private little interesting one-on-one relationships which are all awesome to watch play out in both high-pressure situations and when they're just hanging out on the boat. But this arc, as I mentioned earlier, could have been number 1 on this list because of everything that happens with Casca and Elfhelm. She came back. There will likely never be a moment in fiction with the build-up and payoff that moment had for me, ever again, and it was magical. Not only did Miura continue to flex this time with experimental art styles, but he also created a wonderful symbolic imagery-thick mini-arc with Casca's dreamscape as we followed Shirake and Farnese as they tried to piece Casca back together, slowly learning more about who she truly used to be and more about Guts as well. Then Casca wakes up and I don't have to explain to anyone watching this video what makes that moment so special and the best moment in the series. This arc only promises to get better as we get more conscious Casca, plus we don't even know what the overall major conflict of this arc is going to be yet. It'll probably have something to do with Skull Knight's recent appearance on Elf Island, or maybe Griffith will end up attacking Elf Island like we've been speculating about for years. Again, Fantasia could have been number 1, but it sits here with an asterisk for the time being, and I'm okay with that. Number 5, the Black Swordsman arc. The Black Swordsman arc is the tale of two halves almost. The first 2 chapters really aren't that good. The first chapter is an introductory piece for Guts, but it's not really an introductory piece for Berserk. Most of Berserk does not feel, look, or act like the first chapter. The second chapter is another self-contained story that hints at some of Guts' humanity, and while being inoffensive in terms of quality, it isn't exactly up to the Berserk standard. But then we get into the Count mini-arc and it's fantastic. It is Berserk quality material. Everything surrounding the Count, Teresa, and Vargas is up there with the very best Berserk has to offer. The Count mini-arc is what initially hooked me into believing in Berserk. The ending with the first audience encounter with the God Hand is particularly fascinating, both as a first-time reader and as someone who understands the characters going back. The way it all wraps up perfectly transitions into the Golden Age because you are demanding to know now, after watching Guts and Griffith interact, what happened between the two of them. The God Hand appear for the first time and Miura makes it immediately known that something ridiculous happened between our boy and this hawk-looking prick, and the anticipation within the audience hits a boiling point. It's the greatest hook I've ever seen. You get to this point and you see how uncharacteristically and how rageful Guts acts around Griffith, and not only does it make Guts an 1,000,000 times more interesting character, but it heightens the intrigue of the series. As you realize this isn't Monster of the Week edgy nonsense, something larger is happening and has happened in this plot. a plot that has been left rather vague and mysterious up until this point. You have to know what happened here, and it turns out Miura was about to tell you right now. But even regardless of the finale of this arc, the Count stuff is great by itself. It is the first demonstrable example of what I think makes Berserk so great, the interesting and unique characters. Berserk's greatest strength, I don't want to hear about art and I don't want to hear about plot, is its characters. And the Count, Vargas, Teresa, Puck, and Guts himself, though to a lesser extent in this arc, are all fantastic characters. Teresa is an archetype, but she is pushed to the ultimate extreme, and it's interesting to see here. She's literally one of 5 characters we know of to have seen a God Hand member and survived, along with Puck and Guts from this exact instance, as well as Skull Knight and Casca from the Eclipse. Seeing what this does to this sheltered girl is intriguing. The Count seems like an average, irredeemable apostle prick until he's humanized and made somewhat sympathetic due to his relationship and want of validation from his daughter, which also starts a trend of sympathetic apostles which becomes a backbone of the series. Vargas is one of the first parallels to Guts, as he is also mutilated and scarred from a previous encounter with an otherworldly being. His uniqueness comes from the fact that, like Guts, he isn't just sympathetic, he's vengeful and ready to act. These 3 characters exclusive to this mini-arc are all great. But the main problem the Black Swordsman arc has, and the main problem that keeps it at the virtual bottom of this list, is mass retconning. Miura acts like most of the stuff, actually a vast majority of the stuff here, didn't happen. The only things that actually happened in this arc that Miura seems to acknowledge is that Guts met Puck and got a Behelit. Nothing else that seemed to happen in this arc will ever be mentioned or referenced again. Teresa I don't think will ever come back, though it seems like the intention in her final panel was that she would one day eventually track Guts down. And the Hill of Swords scene is presented as the first time Guts and Griffith have seen each other since the Eclipse, when canonically they saw each other and talked here, which is a massive shame because this first encounter with the God Hand is one of my favourite overall scenes in the entire series. But he's chosen to do this because, as I've come to realise after years of denying it, the Black Swordsman arc just doesn't feel like Berserk. Not only is the tone weirdly nihilistic, which isn't represented in the rest of the series, Guts doesn't act the way Guts should be acting in this arc, and most importantly, Femto doesn't act like the way he should be acting in this arc either. Guts is presented far more talkative and edgy than we will see him later on, even in the Lost Children arc, which canonically takes place around the same time as the Black Swordsman arc. Miura has even admitted when writing the Black Swordsman arc that Casca as a character didn't exist yet, so whatever motivation Guts had at the time was very different and likely contributed to why he acts so out of character here. Miura didn't have his character trajectory planned out and didn't know probably how vulnerable he was going to make the very stoically appearing Guts later on in the Golden Age, which problematically is supposed to have happened already at this point. Though the last shot of this arc is fantastic at teasing the grander and deeper internal conflict dwelling inside Guts. Femto and or Griffith, we still aren't sure, acts completely unlike himself here. We have only ever seen Femto 3 times in the entire series. Once here, then once in the Eclipse, and then when he activates Fantasia. In the Eclipse, Femto doesn't say a word, and he only dumps exposition when activating Fantasia, so his appearance in the Black Swordsman arc is the most we've ever gotten out of him. And I think Miura regrets having Femto be so talkative and basic here. Femto acts like a generic seinen villain here, mocking Guts for ending up back in this position and being very dismissive of him in general. It's very uncharacteristic of the stoic, vague, silent God Hand member we have come to know. And normal Griffith doesn't act this way either. His portrayal here doesn't fit the man he becomes even after this takes place canonically. And I think Miura, in acting like this didn't happen, is rejecting this portrayal outright. Miura obviously changed the direction of this series in between writing this scene and the Eclipse, and I think this has everything to do with Casca. I mentioned earlier that he admitted that he hadn't conceived of Casca as a character when he wrote the Black Swordsman arc, so I think he was under the impression that the Guts and Griffith relationship would drive the manga, when in reality it eventuated that Guts and Casca's relationship would drive the manga. Therefore, many things had to be rearranged, including the directions of both Guts and Griffith as characters, which has led to these retconning issues. So the mass retconning overshadows some of the greater moments of this arc, but even despite the retconning, I think generally everything else in Berserk just happens to be better than the Black Swordsman arc, and therefore it finds itself the lowest ranked completed Berserk arc on this list. Number 4, the Lost Children arc. The The Lost Children arc really isn't a separate arc, but these videos get more interesting if you treat it like a separate arc. Everything to do with Jill and Rosine counts, and everything to do with Farnese we're going to count under the conviction arc. Them's the rules. I constantly go back and forth with myself trying to figure out if the count stuff is better or if the Rosine stuff is better. And I think they're about equal, but the Black Swordsman arc loses out overall because of some of the flaws we talked about earlier that don't exist with the Lost Children arc. The Jill and Rosine stories get full resolutions, and that differentiates it from nearly every other Berserk arc. Jill realizes that she can't solve her problems by running away with Guts, and that Guts can't be the solution to all of her domestic problems. Jill is a traumatized, tragic little girl who just wants to run away like Rosine did, but realizes that if she does, she'll end up down the same road. This want to be saved, this want for affection, and this want to run away that Jill always embodies is embodied in a few panels that her and Guts share that are heartwarming, in a period Guts really wasn't. Like early on when she finds comfort sleeping near him, and later at the end when Guts explains while she's enveloped in his cape that he is not the solution, and is surrounded in his own darkness. Both these panels are great and are used to preface what Jill eventually decides to do at the end of the arc, when she uncharacteristically has a happy ending. Our final time seeing Jill is as she's running home through a field as she has an internal monologue where she realizes that she has to try and solve her problems herself. And trust me, she has a lot of difficult problems to deal with, from her abusive father to his sexually abusive friends to her terrified mother to her feelings of isolation. Jill has a lot of shit to work through, but it's with rejuvenated hope that we last see Jill. Hopeful that at least if she can't solve these problems outright, she can try, just like Guts is trying. We are left on this wholesome note in Berserk where things seem to be looking up for Jill in her circumstances. Rosine also has a character arc that comes full circle here, as she fully embodies the elvish metaphor she idolized as a child about running away and being different. Rosine's last trauma-induced imaginary monologue is beautiful and only further makes her sympathetic, which is something that this arc revels in. Rosine is a monstrous, unforgivable apostle half the time, and a sympathetic former friend and tragic child half the time. The duality of this both in the narrative and internally in Rosine is one of the arc's strongest virtues. Rosine may, just like the Count, be evil. She murders children and fosters these terrifying false elves. But we understand why, because we see the tragedies that led to her activating the Behelit. She's used as another example to refute the notion that Behelits and becoming an apostle freezes your blood, as Griffith puts it. Apostles are just humans with wicked powers and tragic backstories. They are not mindless, otherworldly hellspawn without emotions. They are all people. They are all characters. And this one happened to be a child who went down an unfortunate road. Overall, the Lost Children arc is everyone's favourite mini-arc, but I think the three yet to be mentioned primary arcs of this series outshine it, and that's why it beats out its similar contemporary, the Black Swordsman arc, but doesn't beat out everything still to come on the list. Number 3, the Tower of Conviction arc. The Tower of Conviction arc is the weakest out of the 3 major arcs in Berserk, but it's still so fucking good. I feel like this is the best arc for Guts' character. This is the arc in which he learns to understand what is most important to him. This is displayed throughout the arc as he is literally torn between his hatred of Griffith and the God Hand and his love for Casca and his new burgeoning friends. He makes the decision early on in the arc when he returns to Goto's hut but can't sleep that Casca is the most important thing in his life, and that he will correct his neglectful mistake by bringing her back home safely. Guts is beginning to heal here. He had to let off some steam, so he became the Black Swordsman for a few years, letting his anger with the world be channeled into murderous revenge on those who wronged him, while pushing his body to the extreme to test himself because the primal thrill of fighting was all he had left to enjoy. But through his interactions with Farnese and the Holy Iron Chain Knights, he realized that the world is changing, and that this might not be solely his burden to bear. Then when he finally reunites with Casca, rushing to save her, it's both beautiful and tragic. Casca is such a shell of herself that she can't even defend herself and has become a perpetual damsel. And while we rejoice as we see them reunite, this bitterness seeps in. Guts has to learn that things can never go back to the way they were, but he has to have hope that they can get better. Then the final step of this character arc is achieved when, in the climax of the arc, Griffith rebirths into the physical world. Guts is firstly overcome with anger, but is quelled by Casca's cries in the background, effectively choosing Casca over Griffith. This is also embodied earlier in the arc when Guts starts seeing all the signs that the eclipse is happening again, only to ignore them and prioritize saving Casca. Couple this with the plotline of him learning to trust people again with his Seadro and Puck, and I think this is the best character arc Guts has in the series. But even outside of Guts, the cast of Berserk really begins to come into its own in this arc. Miura isn't writing just 3 characters anymore. All of a sudden Farnese shows up, easily the character with the most development in the entire series, and my personal second favourite overall character after Casca. She constantly gets narrative focus, and this is the first leg of her overall character arc. So, this arc being responsible for her introduction is going to be a massive check in my book. This insane version of Farnese still might be the most attractive anime girl of all time. The sword scene and the fire fantasy masturbation scenes are both amazing, don't deny it. Besides that, Isidro is introduced here, another one of my favourite Berserk characters who's incredibly well written in his own regard. His relationship with Puck is also fostered here in this arc, which I know some people aren't fans of, but I certainly am. Serpico is also around for boring people and Azan is around to be charming. That's the main cast and the characters that are going to become even more important moving forward, but this arc has some great exclusive characters as well, just like Lost Children and Black Swordsman before it. Luca is the standout example here and another one of my favourite Berserk characters. The fact that Miura had the balls to make a prostitute the moral centre of this arc is amazing to me, and even outside of that, Luca is a fascinating character. Her weirdly complex relationships with Skull Knight and the Egg of the New World in this arc are some of the best aspects of this arc. The scene with her listening and sympathising with the Egg of the New World is heartbreaking and a demonstration that Luca is literally the nicest, most understanding person ever. That of course leads to her releasing flowers for him at the end of the arc, which is a masterful last touch to their subtle little relationship. Even Jerome is a cool, unique character that helps the gang out and is never seen again and gets more characterization than probably was necessary here. It's this refusal to have characters be uninteresting that makes Miura's work stand out as literally the greatest of all time. The climax of this arc is also something that needs to be praised. Skull Knight showing up out of nowhere only to be followed by Zod really ramps up the intensity tremendously as we head into the climax, and then them showing up out of nowhere only bolsters the intentional parallels Miura is trying to draw to the eclipse here. We're supposed to be terrified that it's all happening again, especially when Guts stands atop what's left of the tower and sees the God Hand monument form from what once was the top of the tower, and then looks down from the tower as the brand of sacrifice forms from the burning refugee camp, only to realize that again he finds himself separated from Casca, unable to protect her as the world is ending. It's a rush in the narrative that's only matched by the Hill of Swords in my opinion, and an impressive accomplishment for the arc. But the Conviction arc does have one major shortcoming: Father Mozgus. I hate fights in Berserk. The only one I like at all is the Rosine fight, and even that one went on a little too long. But this Mozgus fight goes on forever and I just didn't care. No one thought Mozgus was going to beat Guts, and unlike Ganishka, who was interesting and legitimately intimidating, Mozgus just annoyed me. Guts ultimately killing him was a cathartic moment, but it wasn't worth the volume-long fight I had to endure with this boring prick. Father Mozgus is fine as a narrative device for Farnese. He serves a lasting narrative purpose with her that still resonates with her today. We saw this demonstrated in Casca's Dreamscape, where she uses a memento of him to defend her and Shurike from their enemies, but Jesus Christ, I was so done with him by the time he got taken out here. He didn't need a second form to draw out the fight even longer either. This and some weird pacing in the midsections of the arc held this arc back from boxing with the other two unranked and better arcs on this list. Everything here is top Berserk quality, but I think these shortcomings make the Conviction arc the worst out of the major 3 Berserk arcs. Number 2, the Golden Age arc. I think most people would agree that this was always going to be a 2-horse race, and I think the Golden Age is the second best arc in Berserk, not the first. An older generation of Berserk fan might think this is impossible, but I think the newer generation of Berserk fans would largely agree with this placement. Don't get me wrong, every Berserk arc is fantastic, as is the Golden Age, and I don't want to turn this into me shitting on it to justify why it's second best instead of talking about how great it is to justify why it's second best. So that's what we're going to do. This arc is the most poetic of the Berserk arcs. It's probably the most well thought out and overall structured. It's perhaps the most consistent, and it presents a side of Berserk that's never seen again, with all the military politics and political intrigue. But the greatness of this arc is built on the back of its 3 main characters: Casca, Guts, and Griffith, in that order. The Golden Age is structured to have a perpetual doom clock ticking in the background. We know because of the scene I will continue praising from the Black Swordsman arc that shit between Guts and Griffith is going to break down eventually, but you still get lost. This arc is long and you will forget at times and foolishly allow yourself to feel with these characters. because it's irresistible. I haven't been shy about how much I think Berserk is the Guts and Casca relationship. Not that it's the best thing about Berserk, but that it is Berserk. There is no Berserk without Guts and Casca. Don't get fooled into thinking Guts and Griffith are the driving force. No, it's Guts and Casca. The way that both of their character arcs culminate in the same scene that's also a sex scene, and everything that symbolically entails, is undeniable. Casca is my favourite character in Berserk, and this is the only arc besides Fantasia recently in which she's active. I love that I get to make that distinction now. So this arc gets all the praise that goes along with her, and that goes a long way in the ranking of this list. Now, as vocal as I have been about my love for the Guts and Casca relationship, I have been similarly vocal in my criticism of Griffith, not as a moral agent, but as a character. I'm still working on a video called Griffith is a Poorly Written Character, but this purely comes down to the fact that I don't find Griffith exciting or interesting on his own. I don't think he has personality or charisma, which the manga seems to want us to accept. But everything done with him besides that is brilliant. The theming surrounding Griffith, especially as we get closer to the eclipse, is amazing. The amount of emotion Miura is able to portray while Griffith can't speak and is wearing a helmet to hide the emotion in his face is amazing. The cobblestone path line particularly may be one of my favourites in the entire series, unless we're allowed to include the I want wings line. And if we are, that also is attributed to this arc anyway. The eclipse as a twist, as an idea, and as an entity is wholly unique in its excellence, not only in manga but in fiction in general. But I think just about everyone to ever witness it has said as much. This arc is fantastic. It's one of the best to ever be written, not only in Berserk but in general, but it's not as good as number 1. Number 1, the Falcon of the Millenium arc. The Hill of Swords scene, the Slan scene, the coming together of the party, the introduction of Shurikei, the Berserker armor, the battle between Ganishka and Griffith, the introduction of Farnese's family and Roderick, and the Battle of Vitanis. So much great stuff happens in this arc, and it's almost incomprehensible. The Hill of Swords and Slan scenes are my two favorite scenes in Berserk besides the cheat answer about Casca coming back. I couldn't comprehend that the Hill of Swords scene was happening when I first flipped through those pages and Griffith was there. Rather than avoid the ties he still had to the human world, he rushed to confront them, to see if they still had a hold over him. And the twist that Casca now indirectly had the control that Guts once had over Griffith's heart because of the demon child is amazing. But just everything about this scene is unbelievable. I don't have to explain it because you felt it the first time you read the series. The Slan scene is also interesting, as we learn the most we have ever learnt about the God Hand. We learn that they aren't a collective and that they don't communicate, that they simply exist separately and aren't working for a common goal but have their own individual ambitions and wants. Plus the constant innuendo and the way that Slan absolutely owns Guts with her presence and energy is insane. Then you add Skull Knight to that scene and she calls him Your Majesty, and you feel the history that's still mysterious to us even now. Then Guts kills her with his sword only for her to laugh as she disappears from this realm, certain to return again. It's literally awe-inspiring. But again, the best thing about Berserk are the characters. And the characters began to shine the brightest in this arc as the crew comes together. Shurikei is first introduced in this arc, which seems insane since it feels like she's been around forever. Not only her, but all of Griffith's side of the story's cast are also introduced in this arc, with Sonya and Irvine being particular characters I'm fond of. Also, Zod and Charlotte return and have increased roles, while everything to do with the Kushins happens and is resolved here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Salat, who I somehow haven't mentioned up until this point, and his character arc culminates here. Him refusing Griffith is one of the best fuck yeah Berserk moments, and shows that Miura is hell-bent on making all of his characters interesting and unique. Salat is literally the embodiment of that philosophy to me. But the crew coming together is the best aspect of this arc. Shurikei is an undeniable great inclusion to the party, and Roderick continues to be the most underrated character in Berserk, maybe along with the rest of Farnese's family. This is, after all, the arc where Farnese becomes the best written character in Berserk. Every arc has a character arc and a major one for Farnese. Besides Guts, she's easily gotten the most focus from the narrative in terms of quality on-screen time. Griffith doesn't get that much screen time where he's doing anything, and he certainly doesn't develop. Most of the Griffith scenes are about Sonya, Zod, or Mule, but Farnese is constantly in the spotlight, and she can carry that narrative weight. She goes from witch hunter religious cannot see Puck zealot to a practicing witch's apprentice. It's insane. And meeting her family, particularly her mother and father, are highlights in her story. I love the characterization Miura gave both of these two rather insignificant characters. And I really haven't even talked about Ganishka Ganishka yet, who is another great character and an exclusive addition to this arc. I feel like I've said this a million times now, but the Ganishka flashback chapter as he's dying is one of my favorite moments in the entire series. The aesthetic there is kino as fuck. When I think about Berserk, I think about this arc. I think about the crew traveling around and Griffith's contemporary army, and Ganishka and Vitanis and Farnese's family. I know a lot of people think of the Golden Age as default Berserk, but to me it's the Falcon of the Millennium arc. An arc nearly as good as its name is bad. But overall, that's why this is the best arc in Berserk. Thank you patrons, this video was a lot longer than last month's, I hope you appreciate it. Thanks for the support.